coming out for what I hope will be a very interesting conversation with my friend and fellow Eisenhower aficionado, Susan Eisenhower. I'm sure you all know her, granddaughter of Dwight Eisenhower, daughter of John Eisenhower, Brigadier General, by the way. Ike was a five-star general of the armies. So a very distinguished lineage. But what I would tell you about Susan is she's a strategist, a political thinker, an author of, I think at this point, at least 5 books under her own name, plus major contributions in lots of other books. And she's also well known as a commentator and someone whose opinions are sought really across the political spectrum. So please join me in welcoming Susan Eisenhower to our intimate chat here. Susan obviously will use as a text this wonderful book, which I highly recommend, How Ike Led. I have now a signed copy of it, I'm very happy to say, and you can get a signed copy of it in the bookstore right afterwards. But if it's okay, what I'd like to do is just kind of walk through a couple of, I found very, very evocative moments in the book, and then just ask you to kind of comment on them. Well, thank you. Will that work? I want to. Yeah, I do want to start because I'm sure everybody here would want the answer to the question, and you've answered it 1,000 times in your life. What was he like? What was it like being around General, President, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower?
Well, first of all, Admiral, Jim, if I may call you Jim.
Please.
Thank you so much for your time today and to the Milken Institute for making this possible. You know, that's a really interesting question. I had a very odd childhood, Secret Service for 8 years, and this sort of compartmentalization exercise my parents used to put us through all the time. We were never allowed to be photographed by ourselves. I think it may have happened once or twice, but my father kept saying, now you're not going to wear the boss's stars, okay? And whatever goes on in your grandfather's career is part of what he does, and what you do is you have to report for duty and get out there and do something yourself. And I really appreciated that. But as I inevitably entered the workforce, he was everywhere. And so I actually started zeroing in on what his career had been like, and I'm finding him more and more interesting all the time. Because at home, he wasn't like a lot of people you run into who can never stop working. I think he never stopped thinking. But he wasn't on the telephone. He wasn't doing this because my grandmother was pretty tough. She said, stay in the office as long as you have to, but when you come home, you belong to me and your family. So I didn't see too much of this, except occasionally compartmentalize. This is pretty odd, but Granddad would bring over one of his associates, and we were supposed to dress up, keep our mouths shut, look like really well-behaved children. And that happened in the case of Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle. I mean, these are not minor figures, you know. And probably the most interesting one, if I'm not wandering too far off the subject, was the visit of Nikita Khrushchev in 1959. Wow. And they could not, Eisenhower and Khrushchev could not find a solution immediately to what was called the Berlin Ultimatum in 1958-59, where the Soviet Union gave the United States a date-certain day by which we had to get out of Berlin to break up the four-power agreement there, and that was unacceptable. So Khrushchev was invited to the United States. He ran around the United States for about 8 or 9 days, and then they had a summit at Camp David. Well, when they didn't reach an agreement, Granddad called up my mother and said, get the kids cleaned up and over at the farm in a half an hour. Okay. So I didn't really realize exactly what was going on at the time, but we were very excited because he kind of looked like Santa Claus, without the red suit.
Oh, I love that.
And so there we were. We were sitting in this 1-hour meeting. They'd done a tour of the farm. And what was really interesting is at the end of this visit, Khrushchev went to get back on the helicopter with the president. But before he did, he pinned little red star pins on us, which, of course, at that time was a symbol of Soviet power.
Yeah.
And the minute the helicopter took off, my mother said, "Give me those pins." So then we had a big discussion about that at the table that evening. And my parents said, "Don't talk to the press, don't do this, don't do that." And this man is not a friend of our country. Okay. And then I'm thinking, so why was he at the farm? And that sort of was an enduring question for a long time for me.
Wow, that gives us a real portrait of him on the family side. And I kind of want to come back to that at some point, but I want to pick up something that every military officer learns as you come along in the U.S. military. Of course, we study the life of Eisenhower, but one of the seminal things you learn is about taking accountability, taking responsibility for mistakes. And, the first chapter of your wonderful book is Accountability Without Caveats. You want to tell the D-Day story of the message he wrote that was never, thankfully, delivered?
It's a remarkable story, and this is what I meant about the more I've gotten into his life, the more I've been absolutely astonished at how he managed to gain control over his inner space. Mm-hmm. If you really think about what was at stake just before the Normandy invasion, it's actually mind-boggling. And I think what people don't realize is that this role of being Supreme Allied Commander had never been created before. He was the first to hold this job in this way. He was the first Supreme Commander of land, sea, and air in a multinational coalition. And all of those moving parts, made it particularly precarious in a way. Didn't you think it was interesting that Winston Churchill was sitting on the sidelines, not enthusiastic about this at all, until about 2 weeks before the invasion? So just from a professional point of view, I was really thinking about that. I mean, what would it be like to have your bosses have no confidence in your success? That already is a huge pressure. Then, of course, the Air Forces didn't like the plan. There were all sorts of other difficulties, of course, between the way British think about strategy and the way Americans do, and all kinds of difficulties around who was going to be given prominent roles, or I should say prominent sets of responsibilities. And it goes on like that. Then I think, and I'm not sure how much it's written about, but one of the toughest decisions was the use of the airborne troops, which were part of the plan he put together. Because he saw the original plan and rejected it. He said, we don't have enough force and enough power to this plan. So he added Utah Beach and extended Omaha Beach a bit, and then put an a paratrooper operation here. Well, literally about 8 days before the invasion, his chief airborne commander, Trafford Lee Mallory, came to him and said, I think you should abandon the use of paratroopers because they're going to be eviscerated. The Germans had just moved a division into the area. And Eisenhower said, okay, write your recommendation down to me. And he said, it's important because if I don't accept your recommendation, I don't want you to be fired for something that I overwrote. Because they were firing generals pretty frequently in those days. Anyway, to make a long story a bit shorter, he went to his cabin and spent a couple of hours going through the entire plan again, and decided that the airborne troops were absolutely critical, despite the fact he'd been warned that they would lose between 50 and 70% of the airborne and glider troops. So anyway, then you add the forecast, the decision of the forecast, on top of having to provide the right weather conditions so that the airborne forces had even a half a chance because of the weather. And then you realize exactly what kind of tension and strain there must have been. In any case, he decided to use the airborne forces. I mean, thank God. The casualties were nothing like what was predicted. But he didn't know that at the time. So after he made that decision, he wrote a note saying that if the invasion failed, everyone was well trained, they did their duty, the blame should be on me.
Can I just
please
read that note?
I'd appreciate that.
Yeah,
yes.
so this is Eisenhower right before this this incredible military operation, knowing exactly, as Susan says, that there would be backbiting and there would be those who said, oh, it was never going to succeed. He wanted to take personal accountability, personal responsibility. So he wrote this note in preparation to making it public if the landings failed. So here was the note. Our landings in Cherbourg have failed to gain satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. I would invite all of us to consider what leaders do that today. What leaders are willing to say, I'll take the blame. And in particular, doing so even before the operation is undertaken. That's the kind of person I think Dwight D. Eisenhower was.
There are two other things that are interesting about this, I think, from a leadership perspective, which is what the book really is. It's about strategic leadership. But he wrote that and put it in his wallet, and he was going to instruct that it be used in case of failure. But he didn't also want to look like somebody who was trying to make himself look braver or whatever. So it was a little bit of a secret that this note had existed after the war until, I shouldn't say after the war, but I should say after the operation. But it was eventually put into the archives that are at the Eisenhower Library. I think the thing most moving to me, Jim, is the fact that not only had he already written a note saying he was going to accept full responsibility, but then that night he went out just as the airborne troops were headed for France and an unknown fate. He went out and met them all, as many as he could. And I have had several airborne veterans tell me that they remember him still standing on the tarmac when their plane took off. But he went and he met as many of them as he could. And you know that famous picture where he looks like he's being very serious and there are some paratroopers around. There's a tall paratrooper, number 23. It's an iconic photo that is easy to Google. And it looks like he's saying really, he's giving them a pep talk. Actually, number 23 survived the war and told my father and me that what they were talking about was fly fishing. And, I said to my father, after we met Wally Strobel, who number 23 was, I said, gosh, Dad, why on earth would they be talking about fly fishing? And he said, these boys knew what they had to go do, and they were scared to death. Mm-hmm. The last thing they needed was for somebody else to rub it in. So he was talking to them about life at home, that they were going to come home. Yeah. They were going to go back to their lives before. One of them said, I trained at Bragg, and he said, well, you had a life before that. What was it? Well, I was from Michigan, sir.
That brings me to another wonderful chapter, which is the loneliness of power. And there's a fabulous photograph at the start of that chapter, you know it, which is General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower painting. Can you talk a little about, and you mentioned it, when he came home, he was able to separate the job. Painting, I think, was perhaps a part of that. Tell us about
Well,
that.
I would like to emphasize that he never stopped thinking, but he understood the absolutely important, I'd say even the critical importance is a better way to put it, of rest, allowing your brain to rest, and of undertaking creative pursuits. So there's a new book out that declares him the cookingest president of the United States. He had a kitchen put in on the third floor of the White House so that he could cook, and he had opinions. He had he had very big opinions about ingredients and how you prepare food a certain way. And then he had this painting, and the painting he started after World War II, but he had a little, I think almost a walk-in closet converted into a painting studio right off the family elevator on the second floor of the White House. And he would leave the Oval Office from time to time while they were, after he'd been briefed on things, and do about 15 or 20 minutes or sometimes as much as an hour at his easel. And then he felt calmed, allow his brain to rest for a bit, and then go back down and make a decision.
And you'll know this, but another figure, one of his contemporaries who also was a painter, was Winston Churchill. And it would be pretty marvelous to think of them up in heaven comparing notes about painting, because neither one of them, truth be told, were great artists.
Right.
But boy, those paintings are pretty valuable.
Well, I can say that the difference between the Eisenhower and Churchill paintings is Churchill took it very seriously, and my grandfather did not. He called them daubs, and he spent a lot of time. He actually used them as a way to let people know that he was thinking about them. My prize painting that I have of his, and I have quite a few, because I used to stand behind him on that in that second floor studio, and then he'd turn around and say, "Oh, I'm done with that. You can have it." Okay, I will.
Wow.
But he painted for me when he was at NATO.
Oh.
When he got the news of my birth, he painted the most beautiful painting of what he called a French garden. I think you can Google it, because I did give somebody permission to use it for a fundraising thing at one point. But it's on the message side of a postcard. And on the other side of the postcard, it says "Happy Birthday" in French. So he would often paint his colleagues and the rest of it and put something into the painting that they shared in common. And he did 2 paintings of who is now King Charles and also the Princess Royal for Queen Elizabeth II. And he painted all of his wartime colleagues, including the one of Montgomery is spectacular. And he did a Google Dwight Eisenhower's painting of Winston Churchill, and I think you'll be quite surprised.
Wow, I will do that. I as Susan knows, I revere General Eisenhower. He was the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. I was the 16th. As you can tell, we just got shorter and shorter by the time we got down to a Navy admiral. But I thought I knew about his painting. I did not realize he was also a portrait painter. I'm gonna learn more.
I'm going to go as far as to say I think he was better at portraits than landscapes, because the landscapes he painted from postcards and things like that. He never really did it in real time, but the portraits were usually people he knew well. I have one that in my apartment, and it's of a certain age, and I get a big kick out of it. It's not his best, but it's cute. And he did, but the fact that he had something in common between himself and the subject in every painting showed a certain kind of, I don't know, emotional intelligence, I think.
Yeah. Let me pick up that thread by pulling you, if I can, Susan, to, I think, the best chapter in the book, which is called "When No One Was Looking." And, we say in the military a lot, character is who you are when no one is looking. There's a wonderful story in that chapter about a woman who writes him a letter and asks, would he be willing to visit her son? Can you tell that story?
Yes, Ike and Mamie's personal secretary received a letter, I think, from Mrs. Kaufman, right?
Yes, exactly.
Mrs. Kaufman. And she had read in the paper that Eisenhower was about to go back to Normandy. This was for the filming with Walter Cronkite of D-Day plus 20 years. And she wrote completely out of the blue, Mrs. Kaufman did, and said, my son is buried in the cemetery. Would you stop by and remember him? And so the secretary writes and says, well, he has a tight schedule and we have no idea if he can do that. But he and my grandmother not only went to the Kaufman grave, but my grandmother took flowers and left them there. And then they never published the paper, or the photograph publicly, but they had a photograph taken and sent to Mrs. Kaufman. And that was it. He did so many things for people who could do nothing for him. At that stage in life, he wasn't running for president. He wasn't, he wasn't doing anything that needed public support. He just wanted to do it.
Yeah, it's the final chapter in the book, and it's along with all of the stories, Susan. It's so beautifully written and really hangs together in lovely ways. Let me kind of go back to leadership by picking up on chapter 4, which is called Born to Command. And just ask you've watched not only your grandfather, but many, many leaders. Are leaders born, or are they made, or what did he think and what do you think?
Well, the expression born to command was actually in his West Point efficiency report. He was a bit of a handful at West Point, I've got to say. He was older than his class, and he was constantly asking questions like, why are we doing this, and why are we doing it this way? And it got him into some trouble. Yeah, if you look at the record, he's got a fairly poor disciplinary record. He's okay. He's above the middle for academic accomplishments. But, born to command, I think there were a couple of things to this. Is that he had this extraordinary capacity to attract people. I mean, it's impossible to tell that from photographs today, but I'm telling you, he could light a dark room. You could tell when he was even down the hallway. This guy emitted energy, and one of his older brothers, Edgar, did too. This was just almost a kind of animal energy. And so there was partially that, but he had a kind of balance in life. He was older than, as I said, his contemporaries by a couple of years. He'd put his oldest brother through college before he was looking for a place to get a free education. The other thing is, I'm not sure that, there wasn't a little bit of an irony in that, because West Point had to kind of put up with him. He took up smoking after he injured his knee playing football for Army, and he took up smoking. That got lots of demerits, and he had to, he was punished regularly. But he'd do things like, let me give you one example. I'm not sure this is about command leadership, but he and his roommate were told to turn up in dress jacket. They turned up in dress jackets, period. And this caused quite a sensation. Yeah. This is before women were admitted to West Point. And so that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But he grew up, but he had some of that capacity, and I would say it was also demonstrated at West Point that he was very good to underclassmen. He hated the whole hazing tradition, and he had empathy for people. Years later, he grew up a lot and decided he was going to stop clowning around when his first child, a son named Dowd Dwight, died of scarlet fever at the age of 3. And this is what makes the Normandy story so poignant. He says when he goes back to Normandy with Walter Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite says, what do you think of when you look at these graves? He says, the young men, who served their country, who sacrificed their lives, and their parents who will never have grandchildren. Yeah.
I'm going to open it up for some questions or comments about any of this, anything from Dwight Eisenhower to leadership to NATO. But I want to ask you something as an audience. You don't have to answer this. Susan will answer it for you. But so many people really know the life of Eisenhower, and they can talk to you about him coming out of Kansas, going to West Point, a long career. His career really stagnated in the middle for a long time as I think a major. Pretty amazing. But he kind of kept going, and people know all that, and they know Normandy and D-Day and Supreme Allied Commander, and they know, obviously, he was a two-term president of the United States. What else did Eisenhower do? Kind of right in the middle between being the Army Supreme Commander, all forces, and then eventually becoming the NATO commander. He did something in the middle for 2 years. He ran a university. Very good. And Susan, there's an apocryphal story running around that I've been dying to ask you. Is it actually true or some variant of it? But what I have been told by Army officers is that when he became the president of Colombia, because he was still technically on active duty, a 5-star admiral or general remains on active duty for life. You also got a cook, a driver, a valet. You got the whole package. So he showed up, supposedly, at Columbia University. And then the deans of the various schools of Columbia would want to come see him. And they couldn't see him until his aide-de-camp had ensured that their shoes were shined. They had a haircut. They had to pass the muster of his staff. Is any of that true?
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why not, because in writing this book, which is sort of a kick, my copy editor flagged something about Columbia University, and then I never knew whether it was a he or she, because this was all done remotely during the pandemic. But this person writes in one of the bubbles, I'm so interested in this story about Columbia University. I met president of the university, Eisenhower, because my teacher said, let's go to Low Library and see the president of the university. So they call from downstairs. They didn't even have an appointment. And they said there's a group of young students from some school in New York City who would like to meet you, and he came down.
Nice.
Yeah. I think everybody wants to think that that's the way he was, but actually, if you also read about the war period, he's the one who is always showing some understandings for the GI's little undertaking. One of my favorite stories is that somebody stole his bathing suit during World War II, and when it was finally determined that it was the security guard that had this bathing suit stuffed in his helmet, that his valet said, boy, did that young GI steal the right general's bathing suit, because General Eisenhower has forgotten the whole thing and is not going to press charges.
Oh, that's great.
I'd like to, if I could just add here, I mean, I tried to add a lot of stories from his associates and other things, but I don't know, did you get this impression, Jim? Part of the reason I wrote it is that I think Dwight Eisenhower still has a lot to say to us today. Mm-hmm. The 1950s, we tend to think of being rather, boring, kind of Elvis Presley years with poodle skirts and the beginning of rock and roll and jazz and all those things. Actually, it was a very dangerous time. Oh, gosh, yes. And you come out of the war with massive budget deficits. You come out of the war with only one party, one functional party. The Republicans had lost all of their credibility after the Great Depression. You have a period of massive technological development. Mm-hmm. You have no rules of the road for how to handle international relations in the face of the hydrogen bomb, which is so extraordinarily more powerful than the 2 bombs we dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he had his own brand of how to take things that had never happened before and think them through. So if I may just say very briefly, one of the things that I didn't realize, so it didn't get into the book, but I just realized this man, for some reason, was the first person to handle a whole range of things. In other words, he was put in positions where he had to think things up for the first time, cut him out of whole cloth. First of all, of course, we can say that he was first tank commander in World War I at the age of 27. Then he goes on, of course, we're going to skip over all the slow years there. And then we get to the first Supreme Allied Commander. And then we go to the first commander of NATO. And then we go to the first president of the hydrogen bomb era. It had just been exploded just before he arrived in the White House. The first president of the space age. And then you can have a lot of smaller firsts. Sure. But the truth is that there weren't any rules of the road, and things hadn't been thought through. And in this, I think the study of how the principles he brought to his decisions were important because he was having to figure out what was the long-term play. And I think if there's anything I'm really very proud of is, and there are many things to be proud of, is that he unified this country in the face of a lot of challenges like Joseph McCarthy. Balanced a budget 3 times in 8 years and came this close on another 2 and left his successor with a budget surplus while building all the defenses and the deterrent capability for a Cold War that now featured a hydrogen bomb. And through all of that, he actually turned the Republican Party into an internationalist party. A lot of work went there, but I think for people who are at the level of strategic leadership, as you've been, I'm sure you would agree with this, Jim, is that it takes time to think processes through, to think what contingencies you might have to have if something you try doesn't work. And he, in the book is a wonderful quote about the job of a strategic leader is not to be impulsive and to be thinking longer term. So this must have one side joke that goes with it, which is George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower always used to say, with a smile on their face or some sense of irony, let's not make our mistakes in a hurry.
Great line. Let me open it up for comments or thoughts about anything we've been discussing or any aspect of the global scene. What do you think? Yeah, Peter.
I'm going to ask one of Susan, which is you mentioned the years of his presidency. So he's famously coined the phrase military-industrial complex. So really the question I have is, what do you think led him to, or what did lead him to, out of that really stark warning, right, at the end of his presidency? The second part of that is, what do you think his views of the military-industrial complex today would be?
Yeah. Well, the military-industrial complex is part of a speech that also warns, interestingly, about the scientific technological elite. That's worth reviewing, that one. The military-industrial complex, I think, came directly out of a number of big fights during his presidency. One related to the so-called bomber gap and the other one related to the so-called missile gap. And unfortunately, a lot of what was being alleged that the United States was not prepared or not on any kind of equal footing with the Soviet Union in these advanced technologies. A lot of that was put about by people who were anticipating the 1960 election and wanted to kind of preemptively probably take his vice president out of the running. But the truth of the matter is that's not the reason he put it in his farewell address. They had made his life a lot harder. Now, who were these people? Some of them came from leaks of the Gaither report that was designed to investigate some of these issues. But there were also, the presidential race that began to heat up. And they were, as they were saying at the time, the man to beat is Dwight Eisenhower, even though he's not running for a third term. He left with an extraordinarily high popularity rating. I mean, beyond 68% after 8 years in office. And he, with a Democrat Congress, he passed more than 80% of his legislation, which required a lot of hard work and a lot of building of relationships, but still. And some of the people who leaked those documents were in the military, and some of them were his old colleagues from World War II. And he realized that there are too many lobbyists up on Capitol Hill, that they were interfering with the president's capacity to manage our national security affairs, and at the same time making sure that there was no waste in the defense budget, because we had to go through two defense reform activities during his presidency. And a lot of the services were not happy about that. And they were applying their own grievances up on Capitol Hill. And I think that is really probably the origin of that expression. Today, I don't know what he'd say, and my father always said, don't try and put words into his mouth, because he's been gone a long time. But still, we are going to be having lots of discussions about readiness and other issues like that. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be mindful of the fact that, as he believed, that the American public has a big stake in the decisions that are made, that you can't finance everything at the expense of other things that are important to the public at large. And we'll see how things play out as we begin a modernization of a range of things. But I think I'm just going to leave it there, since I'm more comfortable talking about things that have footnotes that you can apply to them.
Others?
Yeah.
Yes, and then over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm curious, in this current age of polarization, what lessons do you think from his presidency could help rebuild public trust in government institutions?
Great
Well,
question.
he was, it's a great question. He was very even-handed about things. As a matter of fact, his 2 terms as president are called the middle way. And, we have to put into perspective that he was a military man. And so let's just think about what your training is and what your mindset is because of your education and the responsibilities you've held. And his job was always to bring people together in the military. And he thought, as he said, the deep divisions in our country are a welcome sight to an alert enemy. He saw national unity as being a critical piece of national security. And he wrote about it a lot, and he also took the position in terms of tax cuts and other financial things that there could be no winners and losers on the economic scene. That if the wealthy got too wealthy and others were left behind, or if the middle class was threatened, that this too could generate the kind of unsettled relations that again could be exploited by our adversaries. And so this was a very, very different kind of approach. I once walked into, a couple of summers ago, into a group that was, absolutely loaded for bear and couldn't wait to kind of dismantle this book because they weren't Dwight Eisenhower likers. And I don't mind. I will answer everything as best I can, but I kind of enjoy it. So I went in there, and the first thing I said to them, which hadn't even occurred to them, and this is to your point, I said, well, I want you to think about this man in a different way. He went to West Point. Ulysses S. Grant went to West Point. George Washington didn't go to West Point, but, it was part of his legacy. He's not like any other political figure except George Washington and Ulysses S. Grant in terms of training and mentality. So let's compare him to the other two and try a little less hard to think about him as a political figure driven by... In the first term of his presidency, he had more trouble with the Republican Party than he did with the Democrats. His own party was after him all the time, which is so interesting. And he was very tough on them because they supported McCarthy, a lot of them did, and they thought that he should have cut taxes right away. He said, we're not cutting taxes until we balance the budget. Then he did balance the budget, and it was the largest tax cut in history to that date. But let me just end by saying, not only did he try to bring people together, but he had a philosophy about what our security, both domestic and international, would be. It was 3 things. One, and not necessarily in order, but I would say maybe in this order. 1, our military preparedness, our military strength. Number 2, our economic strength. And 3, our moral authority in the world. and that we had to have all three of those, or else we were somehow jeopardized. If you look at them as like legs of a stool, the stool won't hold up. And so that is kind of a philosophy he used to bring people together, both Democrats and Republicans.
Yes, ma'am, right here, and then this gentleman will close us out. There you go.
Susan, what you just said about Ulysses S. Grant and George Washington, he had such a huge scope that other presidents have not had before he got anywhere near the White House, and so much responsibility, and the stakes were so high, and then he takes on 8 more years of that. And I'm interested, what was he like as a grandfather to you? Was he playful? Did he bounce you on his knee? Did he, what kind of was he a serious person?
Well, he wasn't a kind of laugh out. No, he first of all, you have to know my grandmother. My grandmother was a pistol. She really was. Once he didn't like to play cards with her because he got a little exasperated. He was at a completely different level and was playing at bridge master level with General Grunther and others who had already passed that mark. So they're back on the sun porch one evening, and he's decided to go back and keep her company. And then he says to her, "Why'd you play that card?" And then she says, "Because I felt like it." They had this wonderful little sort of like flirtation almost. So I wouldn't say he was funny, but she was, and she really kept him jollied along. Now, as far as the grandparent part, I rode his horses, and he came to a number of my horse shows. When I won my first little award, it was like a walk trot or something, and the trophy was about the size of, it was literally a cup. And I didn't realize it, but about a couple of weeks later, he comes to me with this package that's wrapped up in brown paper, and he said, "Open it," and I did, and he had taken the cup and had it put on a pedestal. So I keep it in my office, like that was really nice. But extraordinarily kind. And then, once the horses ran out and plowed up his golf green, while I wasn't paying adequate attention, and we'll just leave the gory details for when you read the book.
Yeah.
But, he could have absolutely eviscerated me, and he did care about accountability. But, he could see in one look, and he was very good at this during the war, what was going on inside of people. And I think that was the role he played in his own family life, as a kid. In any case, he said, "Wow, I haven't seen horses run like that since I was a kid in Abilene, Kansas."
Yeah.
Yeah, and the golf green had to be taken out. It was the only way he could practice his golf without going to a public course.
Yeah, I want to assure the audience no horses were harmed in that story.
No horses were harmed. Actually, I've survived to tell the tale.
Yeah. What a great story. Sir, final question.
Could I just add one more thing? What I learned is I later read a letter that he sent to Mark Clark, General Clark, during the war, when he was asked about what should you do when people make big mistakes, and he said, "Give them another chance because they won't make that mistake again." Yeah.
Thank you for the book. I haven't read it yet, but I will. I just read a book about the Dulles brothers, and it's easy. You mentioned how scary the world was, and
Yeah.
maybe easy today to stand and be critical of them, but I ask you to do the hard thing. Like, where do they, like, what's your judgment on the Dulles brothers and how your grandfather interacted with them and mistakes, or was it a product of the time?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to understand that I think from the war, if you read a lot about the war history, you start feeling sorry for the Supreme Allied Commander. Nothing but, it seems to me, an awful lot of problems. Understandable, because this was the first, and people had different views, different ideas about strategy. Then you get to the White House, and you notice that he sort of puts his cabinet and his White House structure together that looks pretty much like the war. I mean, he had in his cabinet, which met once a week, religiously on a certain day at a certain time. It met once a week. And he had kind of a Monty figure in his cabinet. You might say that might have been Dulles, always second-guessing everything. Then he's got, his chief of staff was just like General Smith, his chief of staff during the war. So this kind of idea of getting lots of pushback accomplishes a couple of things. First of all, it helped him challenge his own preconceived ideas. But secondly, in the case of Dulles and others, that they had an opportunity to play good cop, bad cop. And occasionally when Dulles wandered off on some issue, he was held accountable. But Eisenhower also believed that you give subordinates a chance to actually do their jobs. And the reckoning will come as to whether or not, it worked or it had. But he had an uncanny notion, I'm told by his associates, of knowing which cabinet members had enough running room, who needed to be watched more carefully. But all this comes from his experience during the war, I think. As far as the Dulleses were concerned, I think he thought the other Dulles about the CIA, I think this is a really important thing, especially since he's often criticized for covert activities, especially in the first term. But if you look, I think it's in the chapter about how Ike's rules for good governance, you will see there that the executive branch had no authority over the CIA until about 1957, 56, in there, somewhere just in those middle years, that some kind of reorganization occurred because they had direct lineage to the OSS during the war. Yeah.
Yeah, let me
Please.
conclude our session. I do want to make a point about mistakes. Colin Powell, one of my great life mentors, taught me many things, but he said about mistakes in a subordinate, he said, you should be able to forgive a general who makes the mistakes of a general. You should be able to forgive a major the mistakes of a major. What you cannot forgive is a general who makes the mistakes of a major.
Yeah.
That's a very profound thought,
Very
I think,
profound.
in today's world.
Yes,
I'm going to
very
conclude our
profound.
session by reading a very beautiful testament to LBJ, written by LBJ, about our subject today, Dwight David Eisenhower. When President Eisenhower passed, LBJ said, "A giant of our age is gone. Dwight Eisenhower began his service to his people as a soldier of war. He ended as a crusader for peace. For both, he will be long remembered by a hopeful world, a world that loved him well. The sturdy and enduring virtues, honor, courage, integrity, decency, all found eloquent expression in the life of this just and good man." Thank you very much for joining us today.